The modern NBA has always been about what's next. Let's look forward. Let's figure out what we can do to improve our team. What's the landscape of the NBA going to look like a year from now? Now that the 2023 NBA offseason is basically over, we're looking towards 2024. And if I'm honest, things don't look that great at the moment. Now, when you're thinking forward into the NBA, there's three things you're thinking about. You're thinking about free agency, you're thinking about star trade requests, and you're thinking about the draft. And all three of those categories are not looking great if you're one of these teams that's trying to make a big move over the next calendar year. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about free agency next year, because there are a couple of teams that have at least floated the idea that they are trying to position themselves to have cap space, to have max cap space in the summer of 2024. And although that's never a bad idea, when you look at that specific free agency class, things don't look that great. Specifically, we're thinking about a team like Philadelphia has discussed the idea of trying to get back non-big contracts in exchange for James Harden if they do trade Harden, because they want to add free agents around Joel Embiid. That's cool. That makes a ton of sense on paper, but these are the big time free agents in 2024 if you're one of these teams that's trying to get max cap space for that offseason. James Harden would be one. He's going to be a free agent. That doesn't matter to Philadelphia, but to other teams it might. Pascal Siakam, extension eligible, might get an extension in Toronto, might get traded. We don't really know what's going to happen there. Buddy Hield, Tobias Harris, Gordon Hayward, Kyle Lowry, Klay Thompson, maybe Jaylen Brown, but we're expecting Jaylen Brown to get the Supermax extension as well. Like, if you take Jaylen Brown off the table, you take Klay Thompson off the table, you take Siakam off the table, all of a sudden you're looking at like Gordon Hayward, Kyle Lowry, and James Harden. Like, that's your 2024 free agency class. Now, technically, there are some other players that I haven't mentioned yet that could be free agents: LeBron, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, OG Anunoby, DeMar DeRozan, Drew Holiday, Anthony Davis. But these are all players that I'm not expecting to actually become free agents, whether they're just going to re-sign with their own team next offseason or get traded during the year or sign an extension. These aren't likely free agents, in my opinion. So when you start taking all those guys off the board, you really are looking at some of these names that I've mentioned previously. Now, that doesn't mean they won't change teams, which I'm going to get to later, but strictly in terms of signing as free agents, these guys are unlikely, in my opinion. And that's obviously not fantastic if you're one of these teams that's looking to make a big move in free agency. But the interesting thing to me is we are going into this new era now in the NBA where maybe free agency isn't nearly as impactful as it used to be, because in my head, before I did this video, I was like, oh yeah, free agency still is a really big deal. We still have a lot of players changing teams. That's not really the case. The biggest players to change teams on big deals the last two off seasons were, this off season was Fred VanVleet, and the off season prior was Jalen Brunson. And no disrespect to those guys, each of them are all-star caliber players. VanVleet previously, Brunson currently, but it's not like the summer of 2019 where we've got Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, all these different guys that are changing teams every single offseason, specifically via free agency. So you might think, okay, well, even though the list of free agents in 2024, with the exception of maybe someone like Harden or Siakam, isn't that great, maybe there will still be some opportunities to really improve your basketball team via trade requests. And that is kind of the new era that we are entering into, where guys don't want to risk losing out on money in free agency. They don't want to have the possibility of, oh, well, maybe I'm gonna go to this new team and miss out on millions of dollars, but at least I'm gonna go to the team that I really want to in free agency. No, they're just signing the big contract. Like, Jaylen Brown might be on a new team next year, but he's probably gonna sign the Supermax in Boston if he hasn't already. As of recording this video, he has not. We saw it with Beal and Lillard. These guys sign the contracts and then they request the trade. So what's the star trade landscape gonna look like this time next year in 2024? Well, there's a couple of names to keep an eye on. Certainly Joel Embiid is one to keep an eye on, depending on the Harden situation. He's gone through a lot in Philly, and I know he loves being there and the fans love him, but at a certain point, when you're getting up there in age, when you've had all these injury issues, when you've gone through as much as you have as Joel Embiid with the Simmons Harden fiasco there, at a certain point he might start looking around. Karl Anthony Towns is another guy I would keep an eye on, depending on what happens with Minnesota this year. At some point they might need to change course and reorganize their team in terms of Karl Anthony Towns somewhere else. They keep Gobert and they fill out the rest of the roster around Anthony Edwards, Gobert, and McDaniels. The Clippers situation is really interesting as well, because they're going to try and get Harden. They're going to try and put together a nice team for their new building in 2024. But if they can't get extension talks figured out with Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, those guys might be on the way out as well. I'm always keeping an eye on what's happening in Dallas with Luka, because despite the fact that I think they had a really good offseason, they easily could miss the playoffs again this year. The Western Conference is absolutely loaded, and there's like 13 playoff level teams in a conference in which obviously only 8 of them are going to legitimately make the postseason, and that could potentially lead to a weird Luka situation as well. But the two that I would put at the top of the list for 2024 trade requests or just looking for a different team would be Donovan Mitchell and Jaylen Brown. Now, Donovan Mitchell depends entirely entirely on what Cleveland does this year, because if they don't do well in the postseason, he's going to start to have some leverage as a 2025 free agent to say, I want to go to this team or that team. He kind of just got traded to Cleveland and was okay with it, but it wasn't a situation that he necessarily was seeking out. And the Cavs might start to panic a little bit if they aren't as good this year as they hope to be, because then all of a sudden he's a 2025 free agent. You could lose Donovan Mitchell for nothing to a team like, for example, the Knicks, variety of other situations. 2025, I think, is an offseason that a lot of teams are targeting to have cap space because there are some big name free agents, Donovan Mitchell being one. So if you're looking at potential star trade request guy number one, I think this time next year that could be Donovan Mitchell. And the other is Jaylen Brown. I fully expect, if he hasn't already, at the recording of this video, he has not signed the Supermax extension with Boston, but I fully expect that he will. And if that happens, that doesn't necessarily mean that Jaylen Brown will still be on the team 12 months from now. That's just how the NBA works. Boston wants to retain the asset of Jaylen Brown. They don't want to let him go to free agency. They have the most money to offer him, and they're perfectly fine offering him that much money. But this time next year, he might want to go to Houston and rejoin Ime Udoka. He might want to go to a variety of different situations that allow him to be the main number one guy. He might just want to be somewhere else. He's had plenty of success in Boston, but maybe he just wants to go to a different team, have different experiences within the NBA. And a trade request a year after signing a Supermax is not a crazy thing to think about, specifically in the context of Jaylen Brown, because of all the rumors that we've gotten about him over the last year about maybe not wanting to be in Boston long term, but as all these players do, wanting to lock up the big long-term contract. So those would be the two guys I would keep an eye on. But you can tell here that when it comes to big time player movement, might be pretty limited next offseason, although the NBA always finds a way to surprise us, which brings us to arguably the most disappointing aspect of next offseason, at least right now, and that is the draft. The 2024 NBA draft is not going to compare even remotely to 2023's, and overall just lacks excitement. I'm not going to say it's going to be one of the worst drafts ever, because every single year it feels like someone comes out and says, oh my gosh, this draft is going to be awful, and then a couple of players, really shine during the season and find their way towards the top of the class and quote unquote save the class. However, this is as grim of an outlook on an upcoming draft class as we've had in a while, which is unfortunate for teams like, for example, Washington, that are now deciding to tank host Wembanyama and might end up with a top 3 pick in this draft, but it might not be a player that's better than any of the top 7 picks of the 2023 draft. So all of those factors together, free agency, star trade requests, and the draft, present a really interesting landscape over the next 12 months in the NBA, where you might see teams be a little bit more aggressive if a big time player does become available outside of Damian Lillard and outside of James Harden, because they know that that might be their only avenue to significant upgrades. You also might see more teams just kind of standing pat and not making a ton of big moves, because they know that if they can just keep their group together, there's at least a little bit of a possibility of them rising above some of these other teams, because if they can continue to grow internally, these other teams are not going to have the opportunity to jump up over them. And it's just going to create a really interesting situation over the next year in terms of team building, because already teams are anticipating a lack of opportunities for improvement over this next year in the NBA. Now, like I said, the league always surprises us. They could always find a way to throw in a couple of curveballs here and there, but that's what I'm anticipating as of right now.